My name is Marjorie Hale, and I was 18 years old when I finally understood why my father had called me a burden for as long as I could remember. I didn't arrive in this world wrapped in hope or celebration. I arrived as a complication, one that two ambitious adults tried very hard to solve quietly. My biological mother, Helen Hale, was a rising star in Chicago's financial district, an investment banker with a reputation for precision, discipline, and ruthless focus. Her life ran on color-coded calendars and 5-year plans that left no room for marriage, children, or emotional distractions. She met my father, Gideon Thompson, at a corporate networking event at the Palmer House Hotel. Champagne flutes, polite laughter, shared jargon about market volatility and portfolio risk. What began as harmless professional flirtation turned into something brief and reckless, casual, no promises, no expectations. Except Gideon had a secret. He was married. His wife, Doris Thompson, had been trying to get pregnant for years. Failed treatments, quiet grief, private disappointments she never spoke about in public. And then there was me. Despite precautions, every precaution, Helen found herself staring at 2 pink lines in the mirror of her office bathroom at 3 a.m. When she told Gideon she was calm, practical, and unwavering, she wasn't keeping the baby. That's when Gideon begged, not because he loved her, not because he wanted a family with her, but because I was the solution to a problem he'd been hiding for years. The deal they made was brutal in its simplicity. Helen would carry me to term. Gideon would take me after birth. No shared custody, no visits, no contact. Just child support payments and a clean break. Doris would raise me as her own, and Helen could return to her career without the weight of motherhood pulling her down. I wasn't a daughter. I was a transaction. For the first 13 years of my life, I believed Doris was my real mother. She packed my lunches, helped with homework, showed up to school events. On the surface, she did everything a mother was supposed to do, but even as a child, I felt the imbalance. When my younger brother Cameron was born, Doris's miracle baby, the house shifted. Suddenly, everything revolved around him. Family photos rearranged themselves. Traditions changed. Attention narrowed. Cameron got the bigger bedroom with the park view. I got the smaller one facing the alley. His drawings went on the refrigerator. Mine disappeared into a drawer. When relatives visited, I served drinks and cleared plates while they marveled at Cameron's laugh, his intelligence, his future. I became useful, convenient, quiet. My father barely hid his disappointment. Doris stopped pretending altogether. The words, "You're lucky we took you in," hung in the air of our house like dust you could never fully clean away. Then, when I was 13, everything cracked open. I was walking through Lincoln Park, camera slung around my neck for a school photography project, when an elderly woman stopped me near the zoo entrance. She had silver hair pinned neatly back and wore a camel-colored coat that spoke of old money and careful taste. She stared at my face for a long moment. "Excuse me, dear," she said softly. "You look exactly like someone I once knew." She asked my name. "Marjorie," I said. "Marjorie, what?" "Marjorie Thompson." Her hand flew to her mouth. "Oh my God," she whispered. "You're Helen's daughter." The world tilted. Her name was Margaret Wellington. She was my grandmother. Sitting on a cold park bench, she told me everything. About Helen, about the deal, about the years she'd spent searching for me without knowing where I'd been sent. Private investigators, school records, neighborhood drives where she hoped to catch a glimpse of a child who might be hers. "She never stopped loving you," Margaret said, tears slipping down her cheeks. "She just didn't know how to be your mother without destroying the life she built." That afternoon split my life in two, before the truth and after. When I told Gideon and Doris about Margaret, they didn't fight it. They didn't argue. They let me go. And that told me everything. By the time I moved into Margaret's Lincoln Park home, I already understood something most children never have to learn. I had never been raised out of love, only obligation. And obligations expire. Margaret Wellington didn't ease into my life. She reclaimed it. The first weekend I stayed at her Lincoln Park home, she handed me a set of keys, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Not a guest key, not a temporary copy, a permanent one, heavy and gold-toned, attached to a leather fob embossed with a W. "This is your home too," she said simply. No conditions. No qualifiers. I didn't realize how foreign that felt until later that night, when I stood in the doorway of the bedroom she'd prepared for me. It overlooked Lake Michigan, with a wide window seat and pale blue walls that caught the light even after sunset. There was space for my things, actual space. A dresser that wasn't already half full, a desk that faced the window instead of a wall. For the first time in my life, I wasn't fitting myself into someone else's leftovers. Margaret didn't interrogate me about Gideon or Doris. She never asked why they'd let me go so easily. She already knew the answer. Instead, she asked what I liked, what I wanted, what I dreamed about when I let myself imagine a future that wasn't dictated by survival. Those weekends turned into longer stays. Longer stays turned into something unspoken but understood. I had been chosen. One evening over dinner, real dinner, with conversation that didn't revolve around Cameron, Margaret told me about the trust fund. "Helen started it the day you were born," she said, folding her napkin carefully. "Not just the child support Gideon received. This was separate. Quiet, protected." My fork paused halfway to my mouth. "A trust fund," I repeated. "She always planned to tell you when you turned 18, Margaret continued. She wanted you to have choices, not obligations. It was the first time I cried at Margaret's table. Not loud, messy sobs, just silent tears that fell into my lap as the weight of something I hadn't known I was missing finally landed. Someone had been thinking about me all along. The contrast between my two lives became impossible to ignore. At Margaret's house, I was asked about my day. At the Thompsons, I was asked what I'd broken or failed to do. At Margaret's, my opinions were debated. At home, they were tolerated at best. When I told Gideon I'd be staying with Margaret more often, he nodded without hesitation. "It's probably better for everyone," he said, eyes already drifting back to his phone. Doris didn't say a word. I moved in fully a month later. Margaret enrolled me in St. Catherine's Preparatory Academy, a private school where teachers knew my name and expected more from me than compliance. She bought me clothes that fit, not hand-me-downs, not practical compromises, but things chosen for me. She gave me a life that made space for who I might become. I was finally starting to believe it, starting to settle into the quiet certainty that I was allowed to exist without apologizing, when the call came. It was a Tuesday morning in October. I was halfway down the hallway at school, late for my AP economics class, when my phone buzzed. Margaret's name lit up the screen. Her voice was shaking when she spoke. "Marjorie," she said, "I need you to come home." I knew before she finished the sentence. Helen passed away last night. Heart attack. She was 42. The world narrowed to soundless motion. The lockers. The students. The bell ringing somewhere far away. I had never met my biological mother face to face, and now I never would. The grief didn't make sense at first. It arrived heavy and uninvited, settling into my chest like something physical. I mourned a future that had existed only in quiet hope, a conversation that would never happen, a woman I had imagined in pieces. The funeral was held at Holy Name Cathedral. I sat beside Margaret in the front pew, watching strangers cry for a woman they'd known professionally, socially, distantly. I cried for what we'd lost before we ever had it. 3 days later, we sat in the law offices of Henderson, Walsh and Associates. David Henderson was calm, measured, and precise as he opened Helen's will. "Miss Hale," he said, adjusting his glasses, "your mother has left you her entire estate." The numbers sounded unreal as he read them. Investment accounts, property, art, jewelry, just over $4 million. Then came the conditions. I had to earn a business degree, maintain a 3.5 GPA, graduate within 5 years, demonstrate fiscal responsibility to a board of trustees. Until then, the inheritance would remain locked in trust. Helen had built her final safeguard the same way she'd built her career, carefully. I walked out of that office stunned. Rich on paper, restricted in reality. I decided not to tell Gideon and Doris. Not yet. Something told me to wait. That instinct saved me. 3 weeks later, Gideon called. His voice was different, warmer, almost interested. "We've been talking," he said, "about your future, about family." I leaned against the kitchen counter at Margaret's house, watching the city move beyond the windows. "What about it?" "Well, Cameron's applying to Northwestern, pre-med track. You know how expensive that is." I said nothing. "We thought," he continued, "that maybe you could start contributing more." Contributing, that word echoed. I hadn't lived in their house for years. They hadn't asked about my grades or my applications. But now, suddenly, I was a resource. "I'll think about it," I said, and hung up. The calls didn't stop. Rumors had reached them. Lawyers, money. Helen's name resurfacing in the business section of the Tribune. By Thanksgiving, they were ready. The manila folders were already on the table when I arrived. And for the first time in my life, I understood something with devastating clarity. I had never been family to them. I had been an investment, and now they wanted their return. Thanksgiving dinner at the Thompson house was never about gratitude. It was about control. That night, the dining room felt smaller than I remembered. The same polished table, the same framed family photos lining the walls, most of them featuring Cameron front and center, smiling, confident, wanted. I took the chair closest to the door without thinking. Some habits are learned early. Gideon didn't wait for pleasantries. "Sit," he said, gesturing sharply to the chair across from him. Doris placed a stack of manila folders on the table, like evidence waiting to be examined. Cameron wasn't there. "Where's Cameron?" I asked. "At his girlfriend's," Doris replied dismissively. "This doesn't concern him." Of course it didn't. Gideon folded his hands. "We know about the inheritance." There it was. I felt my pulse spike, but I kept my face neutral. "What inheritance?" "Don't insult us," Doris snapped. $4 million, Marjorie. From Helen. The way she said my biological mother's name, flat, irritated, made something twist in my chest. "And?" I asked quietly. "And that money should be helping this family," Gideon said. "We raised you. You tolerated me," I thought. "There's a difference." Doris leaned forward. "We fed you, clothed you, put a roof over your head when Helen abandoned you." The word abandon landed like a slap. "She didn't abandon me," I said. "You made a deal." Gideon's jaw tightened. "We sacrificed. And now Cameron has a future to think about. Northwestern, medical school, hundreds of thousands of dollars." I looked at the folders, at the familiar dining room where my place had always been conditional. "You want me to pay for his education." "We want what's fair," Gideon said. "What's fair," Doris added, "is reimbursement." Reimbursement. I exhaled slowly. "I can't access the money until I graduate." "Then take loans," Doris said immediately. "Use the inheritance as collateral." "Or," Gideon added, "you can sign over half of it to us now." The audacity was so complete, it was almost impressive. I stood. "I need time." Doris laughed bitterly. "Time to do the right thing?" "I'll give you an answer after Christmas," I said. "Don't walk away from your family," Gideon warned. But I was already gone. That night, I called David Henderson. He reassured me calmly that they had no legal claim. The will was airtight. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. December passed in tense silence. January shattered it. The calls escalated. Voicemails piled up about blood, obligation, gratitude. Cameron called once, his voice low and careful. "I'm sorry," he said. "I didn't know they were doing this. I'll take loans, scholarships, whatever it takes." It was the first time I realized he was nothing like them. In February, they ambushed me on a college campus tour. "This is more important," Doris hissed, dragging me into a coffee shop. Their new demand was staggering. $10,000 a month while I was in college, and half the inheritance after graduation. I'm not giving you anything, I said. Gideon slammed his cup down. We saved you. No, I said. You used me. The truth burned between us. You're not our daughter anymore, he said coldly. I walked away shaking, but free. 3 months later, the lawsuit arrived. They were contesting the will, claiming Helen was incompetent, claiming I was irresponsible. I felt sick as David explained it. The legal battle consumed everything. Depositions, character attacks, lies dressed up as concern. They painted me as greedy, spoiled, manipulated by Margaret. What they didn't count on was documentation. Helen had planned for everything. And then Cameron testified. I don't deserve that money, he said clearly. It isn't mine. The judge dismissed the case in under an hour. Outside the courthouse, Gideon muttered, "This isn't over," but it was. 2 years later, the truth came in a different form. A safe deposit box. Letters. Proof that Helen had been loving me quietly all along. As I read her words, one truth settled deep and unshakable. I had never been a burden. I had been a secret worth protecting. The lawsuit didn't arrive with drama. It arrived in a plain white envelope, slid under the door of my dorm room at DePaul while I was studying for a midterm. No warning, no confrontation, just legal language that tried to erase me with polite precision. Petition to contest the estate of Helen Hale. I read it twice before the words settled. They were claiming Helen hadn't been of sound mind when she wrote the will, that she'd been emotionally unstable, that I, her biological daughter, had demonstrated financial irresponsibility and therefore posed a risk to the estate. Financial irresponsibility. I stared at the phrase until it felt absurd. I was a full-time student with a 3.8 GPA, working part-time in the library, living on a modest allowance I tracked down to the dollar. I hadn't touched the inheritance. I couldn't. But the accusation wasn't meant to be true. It was meant to be loud. David Henderson was calm when I called him, but there was steel beneath his voice. They've hired Franklin and Associates, he said. They're aggressive. This will get ugly. Ugly didn't begin to cover it. The weeks that followed blurred into conference rooms and court filings. Gideon and Doris painted themselves as grieving parents, selfless, wounded, robbed by an ungrateful child. They claimed Helen had been manipulated by Margaret, that I'd turned my back on my real family the moment money entered the picture. Every lie was sharpened just enough to cut. Blake Franklin, their attorney, was smooth and relentless. He smiled when he spoke about me, as if concern and condescension were the same thing. She's very young, he said during one deposition. Sudden access to wealth can distort judgment. I wanted to scream. Instead, I let David handle it. Helen, it turned out, had been meticulous. Psychiatric evaluations, signed amendments, time-stamped notes explaining her intent, letters outlining why she structured the trust the way she did. She had anticipated this. Margaret testified first, calm, unshakable. She spoke about Helen's clarity, her intelligence, her regret, but never weakness. Then my professors, advisors, people who knew me only as a student, not a daughter, not a pawn. Finally, Cameron took the stand. I hadn't known if he would. Blake Franklin leaned forward, voice smooth. Mr. Thompson, don't you feel that your family deserves a portion of this inheritance, given that they raised Marjorie? Cameron didn't look at him right away. He looked at Gideon, at Doris, then back at the judge. No, he said, I don't. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. That money was left to Marjorie by her biological mother, Cameron continued. It's not mine. I'd rather take out loans than take something that doesn't belong to me. Doris went pale. Gideon didn't look up again. The judge deliberated for less than an hour. The will is clear, Judge Maria Rodriguez said. Executed by a competent adult. The plaintiffs have provided no credible evidence of incompetence or undue influence. This case is dismissed with prejudice. Dismissed. Outside the courthouse, Gideon brushed past me. This isn't over, he muttered, but it was. They moved to Florida shortly after. No apology, no acknowledgement, just distance. I thought that was the end. I was wrong. A month later, David called. "We found something," he said. "A safe deposit box, rented under a different name. Inside were letters, dozens of them. Written to me, never sent." Helen had been there, quietly, painfully, watching my life unfold from the shadows, saving programs from school plays she attended in disguise, newspaper clippings, notes about my grades, my first job. One letter stopped me cold. "My dearest Marjorie, today you graduated 8th grade. I sat in the back row wearing sunglasses so you wouldn't recognize me. You looked confident, strong. I wanted to run to you, but I didn't. Loving you has meant letting you go." The final letter was dated a week before her death. "You don't owe anyone for being raised. That was their obligation when they agreed to take you. This inheritance is my apology and my belief in the woman you're becoming." I folded the letter carefully. For the first time, the past felt complete. 2 years have passed since the judge dismissed the lawsuit, but the silence that followed was louder than anything Gideon or Doris had ever said to me. I'm 21 now, a junior at DePaul University, double majoring in business administration and finance. I keep a 3.8 GPA without panic or obsession, not because the trust requires it, but because for the first time in my life, excellence feels like a choice instead of a survival strategy. The inheritance has grown quietly under professional management. Just under $6 million now. I still haven't touched it beyond the monthly allowance Helen structured so carefully. I live in a modest apartment near campus. I budget. I plan. I wait. Waiting, I've learned, isn't weakness. It's discipline. Cameron and I talk every week. Without our parents hovering, something honest has grown between us. He's thriving at Northwestern on scholarships and loans, stubbornly proud of doing it on his own. He wants to specialize in pediatric oncology. He says helping children fight battles they never asked for feels personal. I understand that more than he knows. Margaret is well. She volunteers at the Chicago History Museum, hosts elaborate Sunday dinners, and pretends not to notice when she slips money into my coat pockets, by accident. Her house still feels like sanctuary. Still feels like home. And Gideon and Doris? They sent a Christmas card last year. "Hope you're doing well. Love, Dad and Doris." No apology, no reflection, just ink on glossy paper, as if the lawsuit had been a misunderstanding instead of an attempt to strip me of my future. I didn't respond. Then, last month, David Henderson called again. "We've been reviewing older files," he said. "There's something else." Another safe deposit box, smaller, older. Inside were more letters, not just reflections, but instructions, drafts of the trust, notes explaining her reasoning in meticulous detail. The final letter was marked, "To be read after the case is resolved." I opened it with shaking hands. "Marjorie, if you're reading this, then you stood your ground. That means you're already stronger than I was at your age." She wrote about fear, about choosing safety over courage, about believing that stepping aside was the least damaging option, and realizing too late that absence leaves its own scars. I structured the inheritance the way I did because I didn't want money to rush into your life before wisdom could catch up. Wealth without wisdom is dangerous, but wisdom paired with purpose can change generations. She knew Gideon and Doris would come after the money. She'd anticipated every move, every argument. You do not owe anyone for the simple act of being raised. Love is not a debt. Childhood is not an invoice. I cried harder than I had at the funeral, not from grief, from release. 6 months from now, I'll graduate. After that, I'm starting my own investment firm, Wellington Capital, named after Margaret. I want to help young women build financial independence without shame or permission. I want to teach them that money can be a tool, not a trap. Sometimes I think about the girl I used to be, the one who stayed quiet, stayed small, stayed grateful for scraps of attention. She didn't know she was being shaped for something bigger. My father used to call me a burden, but in the end, I became something far more dangerous to people like him. I became untouchable. Not because of money, because I finally understood my worth had never been up for negotiation.